Hey guys, and welcome to a new series we're going to be hosting here on the channel called How to Win at Total War Warhammer. A pretty clunky title, but it certainly gets the message across. In this series, we're going to be looking at absolutely everything, looking at replays of battles, talking about how you could have done better in the battles, what was done well, what was done wrong, looking at tactics, tips, tricks, deep dives into every single faction with guest speakers as well, talking about their experience in tournaments and how they like to use forces, how to build builds, but more importantly as well, how to get involved in the Total War Warhammer multiplayer scene, because it is such a fun game watched by thousands and thousands of people, but it is very daunting indeed, so not that many people actually play it, and that's something I personally would really like to change. I've been championing it for quite some time. I think it needs to be a bit more of a easier kind of way into Total War and a bit more welcoming as well. Now, there is going to be a few big barricades when you try to join the multiplayer scene, so hopefully this will help tackle them for you. For those more experienced players, this video may not be super useful for you, but as we go further and further on down the road of this series, we're going to be looking at some tougher tactics and kind of high-level micro skills, getting players involved and showing replays on where people did what people did well, what people did wrong, and all that good stuff. So there's certainly a little bit of something for everyone, but this first video today is going to be focused around which faction should you pick if you want to hop in and play Total War Warhammer. So we're going to do a brief overview of every single faction. And if I pop this little drop down menu, your mind may well have exploded because there is a disgusting number of factions here, but we're not going to worry too much about sub-factions, which are all the ones underneath the main races, because they change very little about how the race plays as a whole. So we're going to be looking at Beastmen today, Bretonia, Dark Elves, Dwarfs, Empire, Greenskins, High Elves, Lizardmen, Norska, Skaven, Tomb Kings, Vampire Coast, Vampire Counts, Warriors of Chaos, and Wood Elves. And that's plenty enough for us to cover today. Now, hopefully by the end of this video, you will know not just one, but probably 3 factions that you would like to play if you are picking up this game and delving into some multiplayer. Now, the reason I say 3 rather than just one is the game as a whole. There's a lot of factions which have a lot of good counters against them, so a lot of bad matchups and a lot of good matchups. You want to be a little bit more flexible than just knowing just one. For example, if you bring Dwarfs every single game, you're going to find a lot of people, particularly on quick battles and on the multiplayer in general, are just going to counterpick you every time with factions Dwarfs are bad against, for example, High Elves and Skaven, and you want to be able to play a little bit more diversity. Plus, learning multiple factions will often actually help you learn your main faction. For example, if I'm playing Warriors of Chaos and I want them to be my favourite faction, then also learning Norska alongside it will probably work quite well because they synergize so well together, and it also helps you realise the weaknesses in all these factions by playing them. So, up first, we're going to delve into the Beastmen and see if they are the faction for you. Luckily, for everyone who is a Beastman fan, Beastmen have received a big old fat update in the latest DLC, so they're in the best state they have ever been in the game, and at that, they are a very powerful faction in the current meta, but we don't want to worry about meta too much when you are just picking your first faction. There's a few things you do want to delve into though, and that is going to be playstyle, as well as will you enjoy playing this faction, because for the most part, you're going to be playing quite a bit. The only good way to get good at Total War Warhammer is practice. Of course, videos like this help. Tutorial videos breaking down movement and tactics and builds really can help out quite a bit, but at the end of the day, you're going to have to hop on your PC, get in there, down and dirty, and start dishing out the damage. So what do the Beastmen offer? Well, they've got a relatively versatile roster in the fact that you have a load of options, but they have a limited playstyle. Beastmen are through and through a rush faction. You cannot play defensive with Beastmen. They have very limited defensive options. You have a couple of Ungor Raiders who can kind of fire in and do a little bit of damage, but they're relatively low down the tier list of archers, and you have but one artillery piece, which is the Cygor. So you're going to have to get super aggressive if you want to play the Beastmen. They're a throttle, straight down, headlong charge, blood and thunder style faction, and their infantry is also pretty weak. So weak infantry, weak defensively, they don't sound like they're doing too good, but the thing Beastmen do have for them is a load of troops and then 1 or 2 heavy hitters coming in the form of monstrous characters, monstrous infantry, and big old single entity monsters. Much like the Jabberlife here, these Minotaurs and your characters, your lords and heroes, they're what's going to win you the battle and dish out the damage. For newer players, Beastmen can be very scary, because from what I've noticed, new players, particularly ones who have come from campaign, tend to like going quite defensive. It feels like you have to micromanage less, which is actually a bit of a hidden trap. I think if you're playing defensively, you have to micromanage quite a bit. So newer players, I recommend actually going for an aggressive faction. It's going to push you to test your micro, charge out and meet the enemy head on, and really be quite a steep learning curve, but at the end of the day, that is the best way to learn. So Beastmen, very fast. Amazing swarm faction with some really cool large creatures and characters, and they are very fun and thematic. They can be a little bit squishy, which again can be problematic for newer players, and their infantry in general is pretty garbage. You have to synergize a lot of your forces. Much like this, you bog down the enemy troops with some cheap units of your own, and then you come in with your heavy hitters, your big characters, your monsters, and they start dishing out the damage. So if you like the idea of a big, monstrous, crazed race of goats with large, heavy-hitting creatures that force you to go super aggressive, then the Beastmen could indeed be the faction for you. Now, we're not going to do too much more of a deep dive into them. I will do eventually a Beastmen guide for you guys, but this is just a nice overview of the Beastmen. Super aggressive, love to rush the enemy, and have a load of big ghouls and monsters, but pretty terrible infantry, pretty terrible range options, so they are a little bit limited in that capacity. Then up next, we're going to be looking at Bretonia. So up next, guys, we're going to be taking a look at Betonia, who are modelled after medieval France, and as you can expect, they are a cavalry-heavy faction, which does require a decent amount of micromanagement, but boy oh boy, can it certainly pay off. Now, Betonia can go a little bit more defensive. They have relatively cheap archers, but there's a bucket ton of them, so you can certainly go a load of range, and you can bring field trebuchets to the battlefield. But for the most part, much like Beastmen, Betonia are an aggressive faction where you really want to sink your teeth into the enemy. They have a real cheap core of infantry troops, basically peasants, a few professional soldiers, but not that many, but they are led by their glorious regal knights. If you really like the aesthetic of medieval France, or the medieval era in general, you're gonna love Betonia. They encapsulate it so nicely. So, are Betonia the right faction for you? Well, again, you need to be a player who wants to get aggressive. You cannot sit back with Betonia. They like the open field and taking the fight to the enemy. They do have one or two super powerful characters and some big creatures, but it is far more limited than a faction like Beastmen. You have one or two mythical Pegasuses and Griffins and so forth, but for the most part, you are going to be basic troops. And that is quite a big thing, because some people obviously want to pop in and play Total War Warhammer to bring all these kind of crazy big large monsters and scary units, but with Betonia, you're not going to get that. It's much more of a historical Total War style of play, and again, some players might like that as well. One big benefit that you have if you are coming into the Warhammer scene for the first time and you've never really played any Warhammer in general in any of the games, the Bretonians are pretty self-explanatory of what they are. They're humans, so all of their units should make sense to you. Men-at-arms are men with arms. Polearms are, halberds, so that's nice and easy to remember. Horsemen are horsemen, knights are knights. There's not too much you can go wrong with. They're a very simple faction to understand and learn. Now, the Bretonians are a little bit of a tricky faction to play, however. They are very, very powerful in multiplayer, but at the same time, they can be very brittle. As you can see here, our build is falling apart right now, though if we play our cards right, we should be able to get back into the game and tear apart our enemy. Having a flimsy infantry core can be really rough, particularly for newer players, as you like to have a nice solid forgiving faction. Betonia, they're not forgiving whatsoever, but they are very cool and thematic. They'll be great at teaching you how to micro, because boy oh boy are you going to need to be able to do it. Hitting and running is going to be very key. Hit and run maneuvers with your cavalry, as well as learning to saturate your troops or expensive knights and so forth, on top of your cheap guys all round. But if you're looking for a medieval style faction, one which will probably feel very comforting if you've played historical Total War games in the past, and then look no further than Bretonia. But once again, they are very aggressive. So if you want to be the type of player to sit back and blow your enemy apart, with cannons and other such units, then this is not the faction for you. If you want to charge Last Samurai style into the glorious sunset as you run over your enemies to save the damsel in distress, then Bretonia may well be up your alley. Good tactics to use for them are hammer and anvil tactics, whipping around the flanks and overrunning the enemy back line, and flank overloads. But we'll cover all that stuff in future videos. So I hope you guys enjoyed the Bretonians, as we're going to be moving on to our next faction. So up next, guys, we're going to be taking a little look at the Dark Elves, the first of our 3 elvish factions today, and their aesthetic is very edgy, very early 2000s emo. These guys, not the happiest bunnies in the world, but at the same time, they are pretty damn cool. Now, as a faction and playstyle, they are actually very versatile. You have access to some large creatures, like this amazing looking Hydra right now, who's rather happy to be on the battlefield. You can have cheap infantry, you can have elite infantry, you can have artillery pieces, a bucket ton of range, and a load of cavalry. You have light cav, heavy cav, a little bit of everything, and even some of your characters can come to battle on the back of mighty war beasts and chariots. So a faction that can do a little bit of everything. They sound pretty damn cool to me, but they do have some big drawbacks as well. Like all elves, they are very, very squishy, and that makes them high risk, high reward. The biggest advantage, though, you will have as Dark Elves is they are a fast, mobile faction. Speed is the key to a good Dark Elf player, and also for having good fun with the Dark Elves, because otherwise you could find yourself overwhelmed. Dark Elves aren't tend to be able to go toe-to-toe with the enemy head on. You need to be sneaky. You have to go around the flanks, out-skirmish your opponent, pick them apart from afar, and then come in for some crucial strikes. And you've got a hell of a lot of heavy hitters on your side. For a faction with so many large creatures, they do lack healing, however, so are slightly less forgiving than some other factions in the game, and particularly some of the other elvish factions that we are going to be writing off on this list. But if you like the dark, brooding bad guys, then the Dark Elves certainly could be good for you. Now, they're a very unforgiving faction, being very costly and very squishy at the same time, so you don't want to make too many mistakes whilst playing them. But I still would recommend them to new players if you like elves in general, because they have a little bit of everything. As the Dark Elves as a whole, there's not too many playstyles you cannot play. Of course, they are best when they come to mobility, really looking to overwhelm the enemy with their light cavalry and skirmish forces. And I've got to say, skirmish is a very key part of Total War Warhammer as a whole. You're going to need to learn to do it, so why not start at the start with the Dark Elves? A really fun faction with, again, heavy monsters, a mixture of cavalry, and some pretty cool infantry. If you like the bad boys, and you like to have a versatile faction who's very fast and hard-hitting, then look no further than the mighty Dark Elf forces, and maybe they'll look after you. Up next, we'll be moving on to a different faction. So up next, guys, we're going to be taking a little look at the Dwarfs. I'm sure Dwarfs in general don't need much of an introduction to you, as these dwarfs are basically very similar to Tolkien's Lord of the Rings dwarfs, and boy oh boy am I passionate about these guys. They're a super fun faction to play, but they have some massive drawbacks and some massive pros, which will probably determine if you want to play them or not. Dwarfs, on a whole, almost in every single game, are going to be the defenders. Dwarfs really lack mobility. They are the opposite of the Dark Elves. They're very cost effective, they're very slow though, not much speed, but they're tanky and pretty damn forgiving at that as well. You accidentally leave your Longbeards in a bad situation for too long? Don't worry, they'll hold the line for an absolute age and laugh as they do so. The Dwarfs always want to be defensive, apart from one or two very few situations against factions who are going to outrange them. Then you need to get a little bit aggressive with your Dwarvish folks. So if you like a defensive style of approach, you're certainly going to love the Dwarfs. Once again, they've got really so much character in this faction as a whole. They really do drag you in, and if you're a fan of Dwarfs in general, just play them. Play Warhammer Dwarfs. Warhammer Dwarfs are amazing. They really do match up quite well with Tolkien's ones, and I think sometimes actually have a better lore and are a little bit more interesting. So you have an insane amount of heavy infantry. In fact, pretty much everything in your army is going to be heavily armoured, at least to some degree. So slow, ponderous, but heavy armour can go toe-to-toe with most factions in melee, but as you can see here, your opponent is going to have to use skirmish to try to get into your back line and shut down some of your slow-moving back units. Arguably the best artillery faction in the game as well, so if you want to sit back and shoot your opponent, you can certainly do that for the Dwarfs, but please don't mistake the Dwarfs for having a lack of micromanagement. You, if anything, have to have better micro if you are playing a defensive faction as Dwarfs than you do if you're an attacking faction. Because your opponent is going to get the opportunity to pick and choose the engagements, and you have to counter that where possible. You cannot be static as Dwarfs, though it may seem to a few players that you're just sitting back and not doing too much. You actually have to do a ton to try to counteract your opponent as quickly and effectively as possible. Now for new players, would I recommend the Dwarfs? It's a bit of a gift and a curse, I'm afraid. A lot of campaign players love playing Dwarfs because against a computer you can sit back and the computer will not be able to get into your back line. They will throw wave after wave of troop into your front line, praying for some kind of success. But against a well-trained opponent, they're going to slip in and find the gaps and start shutting down your range units. Likewise, if you play Dwarfs, be prepared to be counterpicked quite a bit. They're a very Marmite faction, or bipolar faction I should say, where some of their matchups are amazing. Like the Dwarfs destroy Empire, the Dwarfs destroy Vampire Counts, but likewise, they really struggle up against a few factions as well. So you've got to be prepared to get down and dirty. Now, there's no unwinnable matchups in this game whatsoever, particularly the Dwarfs, who have got quite good recently. They got some nice buffs in the latest DLC, but it certainly can be a tough slog for new players, and you're going to have to learn to lose quite a bit before you get better with the Dwarfs. Top level Dwarf players are really scary, and at the same time, newer players tend to find the Dwarfs quite daunting to take down because they don't know how to open up and crack defensive formations, box builds, onion builds, and so forth. In fact, I'll probably do a video in the near future just showing people how to destroy Dwarfs and break down those type of builds. But again, if you like the Dwarf aesthetic, if you like Vikings mixed in with your Dowie folklore, then you're going to love the Dwarfs, particularly if you're a defensive-minded player who doesn't mind your opponent running rings around you with fast-moving cavalry and large creatures, because, yeah, Dwarfs, no cavalry, no large monsters, you're down and dirty with your heavy infantry builds. But if that sounds like your cup of tea, definitely consider checking out the Dwarfs. So up next, we're going to be looking at one of the most popular factions in Total War Warhammer, and that is the Empire. And there's quite a few big reasons why the Empire are so popular. Not only are they a very fun faction to play in general, they are incredibly versatile, arguably the most versatile faction in the entire game. They have a little bit of everything, though they do tend to struggle with the infantry fights. They have some of the best range, some of the best artillery pieces, and some of the best cavalry and characters that you could possibly hope to receive. Now, one other reason I think the Empire are very popular is that they're humans, and there's certainly something to say about playing humans in a game where there's an insane amount of large, scary creatures who could rip you apart whilst still half asleep, and there's something quite heroic, I think, about being in the Empire. However, the main reason that I am going to indeed recommend the Empire to people who have no idea what I've been talking about so far, no idea what Total War Warhammer is or even really how to play it, then I would definitely recommend the Empire. They are such a good faction to get into the game with. They can play in pretty much any playstyle you would like. You want to be an aggressive player? Play Empire and go heavy cav. You want to be a defensive player? Go a load of artillery and handgunners, sit back and obliterate your opponents from range. They do absolutely everything. Now, they can be a relatively tricky faction to a point. They're a real kind of the sky's the limit with Empire. The better you get, the better Empire become. There is no skill cap at the top. Some factions, when you get to a certain level, they can only do so much. Empire, because of their flexibility, really have no limits on what they can achieve and bring to the battlefield. Likewise, for newer players, they are very easy to understand if you know nothing about Warhammer lore. Don't worry, a spearman is a spearman. A outrider is an outrider. A horseman, a Empire Knight, is a knight. It's all very simple and nice and easy to understand. They're very popular, I think, for this reason as well, for the most part, but don't let that take away that they are an incredibly cool faction. They do indeed come in with some monsters, very limited though. It is, again, in a relatively medieval sense, though a little bit more advanced. We have handgunners, but you've got your state troops, your cavalry, and your heroic knights leading the charge. So nothing like the Beastmen, no gigantic minotaurs running around. You have one giant griffin your main character can be brought on, but that is about it. But if you want to play the ultimate good guy, probably the most relatable faction, who is incredibly versatile, good at doing basically everything. They're kind of the... we can do... with the tricks of the trade, we can do a little bit of everything, but we're the masters of none, unfortunately. So that is a little bit of a problem with the Empires. They don't have the best cav, they don't have the best range, they don't have the best infantry, but they have solid across the board for all of those. So if you want a nice flexible faction, which is relatively forgiving and can be played in a multitude of playstyles, maybe if you don't know your playstyle yet, you don't know if you want to be aggressive or defensive or skirmish, go Empire, because whatever you end up choosing, they can handle it. So up next, we're going to be taking a tiny little wee look at the forces of the Greenskins. And if you're just here for a good fun time and you just really want to delve into the lore of the Warhammer universe, you can get no better faction than the Greenskins. They are absolute lunatics. They come in with a bucket ton of super janky, super fun units, which will take a little while to learn, but once you do, my god, can they be disgustingly powerful. Now, for the most part, the Greenskins will come across as your basic rush faction, much like the Beastmen who we did look at earlier, and I must say, for the most part, Greenskins are very aggressive and quite skirmish focused as well. But they're nowhere near as skirmish focused or super light and fast as the Dark Elves, because they can do a bit of a both. They're going to hit you in the face with some hard hitting infantry. You have Black Orcs, Savage Orc Biggins, Orc Boys who can swarm and overwhelm your opponent with deadly efficiency. Likewise, you have some of the most powerful characters in the game who are certainly very thematic. Personal favourite of mine, I must admit, is Wurzag here. Just look at him go, so happy to be here on the dance floor and the battlefield at the same time. Greenskins will give you a little bit of versatility, but they certainly do lack static range firepower, and their skirmishers can be limiting, though very powerful. So you're not really going to want to play Greenskins if you want to sit at the back of the map. It is possible, because you can bring Goblobbers and Doomdiver catapults and hope your opponent rushes you, but the power of the Greenskins is all about momentum, and momentum is best formed when you're picking the fights and you're getting aggressive. They have a really cool faction trait. All the factions do indeed have traits. I haven't really gone over them too much today, but this is more of a brief description of every faction to see if that sounds like your cup of tea and you want to delve into them. And their faction, though, is quite an important faction trait, is called the War. So the more fighting you do, the War bar will fill up, you can pop it, and your troops will fight better and harder for a longer period of time, which certainly can obviously give you a big advantage if you can pop it at the right moment. Greenskin builds tend to be really wide, so there's quite a lot going on the screen at one moment. You don't really see that many high elite kind of tier infantry for the Greenskin, so particularly quite big builds, not really small builds, which if you're a little bit daunted already at micromanaging so many units, I understand if you're brand new to multiplayer, this army may look absolutely insane to control and almost impossible, you would say, then Greenskins certainly aren't the ones for you. But if you're quite happy to learn how to micromanage a huge army of thousands and thousands of raving goblins and orc units, then honestly, the Greenskins could be perfect for you. They are certainly a very, very fun faction to play. They've been quite dominant in the multiplayer scene as well for a long time. They have received recent nerfs, but trust me, they are still one of the most powerful factions in the entire game and can be a hell of a lot of fun to play, particularly if you love getting up in your enemy's face and having a load of wacky mechanics to help support you. Their magic is absolutely ridiculous. If we take a look here, you can form a gigantic green foot to come down and stomp your enemies and just eviscerate them in glorious clouds of blood and magical swirls of war power. So, for the most part, if you want a faction which can be super aggressive, use a bucket ton of tactics, be one of the most versatile rush factions, who at the same time have a load of character. Probably the most character, I would argue, in the game as a faction. They just swirl around and don't mind having some quite funny, janky units, then the Greenskins could be perfect for you. Now, if you want to learn them at a top level, it can be a little bit tricky. They've got a load of micromanagement involved with them, because not only are you moving gigantic armies of 20 units around quite often, a lot of their units have special abilities which you have to manually pop, such as loons, which are basically goblins who swirl around on giant wrecking balls to run over the enemy, which sounds amazing, but all of this has to be clicked and managed. So they certainly can be quite a tough faction to learn, but if the Greenskins sound something that you would want to be interested in, because one, they're very fun, they're absolutely mad, aggressive, and unpredictable, then the Greenskins certainly could be the faction that you'd want to choose today. So up next, we're going to be taking a look at yet another faction. So guys, here we have the faction we've been bullying all day. We've been going up against the High Elves. So this is the second Elvish faction that you'll be seeing today out of the three, as we already looked over the Dark Elves. Now, High Elves can be considered relatively similar to Dark Elves in the fact that a lot of your units are very expensive and very, very squishy. They're a high-risk, high-reward faction, though they are a bit better at being defensive than the Dark Elves. They're slightly worse in the mobility front themselves, but I mean, compared to most factions, they are very swift and deadly. If you like factions with plenty of long-range potential, they have some of the best archers in the game and some really hard-hitting characters, cavalry, monsters, then this could be the perfect choice for you. Not only do you get to wield gigantic eagles, dragons, and heavy cavalry, such as the glorious and regal-looking Dragon Princes now, you can also bring some of the most elite infantry in the game who can cleave and decimate your opponent. Now, they're cheap troops. I say cheaper. They're relatively expensive for cheap troops. Will be able to hold the line, but not dish out too much damage. So your cheap troops aren't really here to put in that much work. You are not a solely infantry faction. Your ground troops are there to help synergize with your big monsters, your eagles, as well as your long-range troops. But the High Elves have certainly a wide roster that you can bring to the battlefield. They are certainly an unforgiving faction, however. Even your lords can be very squishy, and if you just take your eye off them for a little bit too long, then they're going to be completely kaput and gone from this realm, which can certainly cause you some big problems. They're one of the most versatile factions when it comes to magic, so if you do indeed love your mages, the High Elves are going to be very much up your alley. Personally, High Elves being sitting back and being defensive is arguably the best way to play them. It really does depend on the matchup. Now, High Elves have one or two matchups which are really bad for them, but for the most part, they're actually a pretty solid faction to start learning with, despite the fact they can be a little bit unforgiving due to the fact, as I said before, they are a very squishy faction. But if you don't mind, unfortunately, losing some games off the rip just because you've accidentally thrown away and killed your lord, then the High Elves are actually a really fun race to play, and I wish more people played them. They're not that common, but again, massive amounts of magical potential, loads of cool cavalry and big scary monsters, and a nice roster of relatively well-balanced roster on that you've got your range, you've got your cavalry, you've got your artillery, you have your big monsters, and they can certainly do some lovely damage. Look at these lines go. I mean, how can you not want to play High Elves when you have war lines you can be brought into the battlefield and drown down your enemy in glorious arcane fire? They're relatively fast moving as well, so if you do like to skirmish, the High Elves certainly can do that. But if you're looking for more of an attrition style faction that is going to get beat back time and time again, but they hold on and continue to scrap, the High Elves are not for you. They do not have the stomach for such long engagements. They're very fast, aggressive. We're going to hit them. We're going to hit them hard. And that goes for all of the Elvish factions here today. But if you like the sound of the High Elves, certainly give them a whirl and see how you get on. But now, we'll be moving on. So up now, guys, we're going to be talking about my favourite faction, the mighty Lizardmen. And I may be slightly biased when I say this, but they are by far the coolest, most badass, and best faction in the entire game. As I said, maybe slightly biased there, but they're actually a fantastic faction for new players. I would argue the third best faction, Empire being number 2, and we'll get to number 1 a little bit later in this guide. But I really do think the Lizardmen are arguably really good for new players, because not only are they incredibly versatile, they are so much fun to play. They have some of the coolest, most unique playstyle and units in the entire game. Now, they have a bucket ton of cheap infantry, skirmish infantry, heavy infantry, monsters, cavalry, monstrous infantry. They have everything, and if dinosaurs, riding dinosaurs doesn't tickle your fancy, I really have no idea what to say to you as a person, and hopefully we never meet. I am joking there, of course, but in all seriousness, the Lizardmen are actually very powerful. They do certainly lack quite a few elements. They, again, are an aggressive faction. We've gone over quite a few aggressive ones so far, but the Lizardmen very, very rarely sit back and shoot. There is sometimes you may be able to get away with it with some great bows and some solar engines and other artillery-style dinosaurs, but they have no archers, they have no handguns. All of their range comes in the form of throwing javelins and blowpipes, so you're certainly going to need to get up close and personal to the enemy if you want to dish out the damage and actually overwhelm them. But they are a very, very forgiving faction. You have some of the tankiest infantry in the entire game, as in low-tier infantry or mid-tier infantry, in the form of Saurus warriors. Your lords are incredibly durable and can certainly take quite a few more punches than your average lord, particularly if you bring some gigantic dinosaurs. And if you forget your lord for a little while, or you forget your front line for a little while, that's fine. They'll still be there when you get back. They have a huge array of different magic they can bring to the table, and though they are an aggressive faction, once again looking to attack and push into the enemy because of that lack of range, they are relatively versatile in how you do it. You can go skirmish heavy with a load of little skinks, which are these little fellas down here who are very swift moving, good at counter skirmishing the enemy, or you can bring the pain just like Nakai the Wanderer is intending today by charging forward with a giant scaly fist and beating the snot out of your opponent that way. Giant dinosaurs, of course, are very fun to use, and as far as the large creatures in Total War Warhammer go, they are some of the toughest, tankiest boys in the game, coming with thick, scaly skin to keep them in that fight just that little while longer. Now, if you want to be a defensive force or a very swift moving force, Lizardmen, unfortunately, aren't for you, because, as I said before, they're very aggressive, no archers, no handgunners, just blowpipes and so forth. And yes, skinks are quite fast, but your dinosaurs are relatively slow for large creatures, and likewise, Saurus warriors, Temple Guard, who are going to kind of be some of your main infantry, are not particularly swift across the ground either. So a slow, aggressive force who likes to slow push forward with amazing infantry, very cost-effective infantry, who also is supported by large magical dinosaurs and some of the best characters in the game. And as I said before, I am a Lizardman main, but easily the coolest design units, both in style. So if you're looking to bring fun faction who looks cool and really want to show off to your friends and be like, hey look, I'm a Lizardman main, then you know this is indeed the faction for you. And because they're so forgiving and so tanky, and again, getting you to go forward and aggressive, I think they're perfect for newer players, because at the end of the day, if you do only play defensive factions, you're going to get caught out and become quite a predictable player. So I think at least learning one faction which has to move forward, you don't have the opportunity not to, is a really good starting point for a new player. So I would highly recommend the Glorious Dino Boys. So guys, up next we're going to be delving into one of my favourite factions, and that is the mighty forces of Norska. They are Vikings who are devoted to evil and the Chaos Gods, and boy oh boy are they an insanely fun faction to play, but are one of the most limited factions at the same time. You only have 2 legendary lords and 1 basic lord, so unfortunately you're going to have to get used to playing the same characters over and over and over again. But considering the setting of Total War Warhammer 3, they probably will get updates in that game, so it might be worth learning them nice and early now, so prepared for when that does indeed happen. So what can I say about Norska? Why should you play Norska? Why should you be as interested in them as I am if I'm saying they're so one-dimensional? Well, again, they are a rush faction, but they are the rush faction. They have 0 artillery, 0 archers, and their only range of throwing axes and javelins, though that can come in the form of horseback as well. And if you're going to play Norska, you're going to need these guys, because you can otherwise be picked apart and led around the map like a blind raging bull, and you need some kind of skirmish cavalry, some skirmishers such as the Warhounds to help protect you from falling into that trap. But Norska's playstyle is one of the most satisfying in the game, because it is completely, I'm going to punch you in the face as hard as I can and see what happens from there. Now, they do not have the tankiest infantry, they do not have heavily armoured infantry, but they do have the most aggressive infantry, and it works a lot with momentum. Almost all of the infantry are berserker-style warriors. The more they fight, the stronger and more powerful they become, as that blood fury does start to reign over them. And it is so cool to see some last Viking warriors in an absolute blood frenzy dragging down the enemy. And it's, yeah, honestly a sight to behold. Now, for the most part, Norskans, because of their lack of armor, are incredibly swift. So think of Dark Elves if they're way less versatile, but way better at rushing and way better at melee combat. They have some really fun characters as well. You can get gigantic werewolves, mammoths, so you certainly do bring a ton of large creatures to the game, alongside at the same time still having that real life kind of look of being Vikings, which again, I think everyone likes Vikings. I don't think I've ever met anyone who's like, no, Vikings suck. Vikings are cool, and we all know it. So if you want one of the most one-dimensional factions in the game, there's not too much I can sell them on to you for, to be honest. They rush with large monsters and human support, or in fact normally humans with a bit of monster support in the form of Fimir, giants, gigantic werewolves, frost dragons. They have a load of cool stuff, but at the end of the day, they have one plan. Your opponent's going to know exactly what you're going to do, but can they stop you is a completely other question, I suppose, because often you know the Norskans are going to rush you, but that doesn't really matter if you can't stop them from rushing you. They have some matchups they are very good in, but they also have big glaring holes. No elite cavalry, although they can kind of get away with that because they do have a load of monstrous infantry, werewolves and the like, but they also are quite easily abused. And the way they get abused is by people who have ranged air troops. Because of their lack of missiles, the Norskans really can't shoot down dragons, hawk riders, anything which flies and has a ranged attack can really bully Norska, so you're going to have to get used to managing your skirmish cavalry. I would recommend Norska to newer players though. They play very similar to how Beastmen play and how Chaos play, so if you want to learn aggressive factions, that is a perfect triplet for you. And you don't have to worry too much about protecting the back line. You don't have to worry too much if your units die because they tend to be relatively cheap and you have a load of them. And all your goal is I'm going to attack the enemy, learn how to break into someone's back line, and take down their key characters. So Norska, super fun to play, but very one-dimensional and just screaming in your face as they charge to their doom or to victory. Now we're going to be looking at one of the most unique factions to Total War Warhammer. So far we've gone through elves, dwarfs, different type of human factions in the form of Norska, Betonia, Empire, but Skaven, unbelievably fun faction. They are just a swarm of rats who have wacky inventions, care very little for their own lives, and are looking to overwhelm the opponent at any means necessary. They are thematically so awesome and so badass. An army of living, just an army of like wandering flesh and rats. It's disgusting, it's horrible, and I absolutely love it. Not only that, they are so good in their versatility. They have a load of long-range potential. They have a good amount of artillery pieces. They have weapon teams, which have a mixture of flamethrowers, down to people who throw grenades, down to literal sniper rifles, as we can see here. They do it all in long range. They don't have any flying troops, but apart from that, they have a nice mixture of low-tier infantry and mid-tier infantry, but do really lack in your high elite warriors. There's not going to be any troops like the Dwarfs, for example, who will fight to the bitter end. Every Skaven is out for himself and would rather run away and come back and live to fight another day than fight in the name of a dead cause. Now, the Skaven are going to have huge builds, and that can sometimes be a little bit of a problem for newer players, because there's a lot going on in the screen at one time with the Skaven, but they are totally worth trialing out because you can play them in a load of styles. You can get really aggressive with them, you can go very fast and skirmishy with them, or you can sit back and have a fun time. And that's what I quite like about the Skaven for newer players. A lot of your units lack leadership and aren't going to be sticking around, so you are going to have to look around the battlefield and drag back your troops once they've rallied. But they're a good faction to learn defensively if that is your comfort zone to start with, and then you can progress upwards and start attacking a little bit more, because this faction can do that just as well as they do indeed defend. I think all round they have a relatively decent set of magical spells as well, a load of fun characters, and the majority of them are actually really competitive. And they do take a little while to get used to. You do have to use your magic rather well, learn how to use sacrificial lambs to the slaughter in the form of Skaven slaves and clan rats to allow your better units to really dish out the damage. But I don't think that's too hard to learn, to be honest. You throw your terrible units at the enemy, and then all of your micromanagement just has to be on these key ranged units, or elite in kind of monsters and war machines that are really going to seal the deal and cut down your enemy for good. So if you like a mad lunatic, I'm trying to think of the best way to describe them, almost a Pinky and the Brain style faction with a load of wacky inventions, a load of character, some really fun units with some amazing voice acting, I should say. I mean, look at them go! Look at them go, he's basically got jetpacking into the enemy whilst going through a load of warp fire. There's rats all over the place dying. It is such a fun time. I really recommend at least trying out Skaven if you're not going to pick them. Predominantly a range faction who go really defensive with a load of cheap troops to bog down and slow down your enemy while your key units dish out the damage, but they do have the potential to get aggressive and have some bigger damage dealer infantry units at the same time. So Skaven, they get a big seal of approval from me. Though I don't play them terribly often myself, they have a load of potential to keep you going and get a nice little introduction into Total War Warhammer. And next, we'll be moving on. So now we're going to be taking a cheeky little look at one of the most unique factions in the game once more, looking at an undead faction, and these guys are going to be the Tomb Kings. Now a lot of Tomb King players are going to absolutely hate me for saying this, but they do play relatively similar to the Skaven. You have a load of cheap infantry to hold back the enemy, and your range tools, your big monsters and your chariots are going to seal the deal for you at the end of the day. Now they are very different in a way to the forces of Skaven, and in somewhat I think maybe a slightly better starting faction than the Skaven. So with the Skaven, we spoke about the fact they have really terrible leadership and are often running away. So you kind of have to look all around the battlefield, grab your troops and bring them back. Well, undead factions in Total War Warhammer don't have to worry about that. They crumble to dust rather than running away, meaning you can leave your troops fighting till the bitter end, which sorts a lot of your micromanagement problems. And if you've been taking note of anything today, is that this game requires a decent amount of concentration and micro, and by micro I mean you're going to have to be darting around the battlefield, looking after all your troops and getting them into the right place at the right time. There are a few things, however, that I do want to add to the Tomb Kings that the Skaven don't possess, and that is they have a much wider variety of large monsters. You have the Sphinxes, you also have gigantic titans who can come into battle whilst also wielding magic. You do have to be a little careful, however, with the Tomb Kings. Their lords can be made very tanky, likewise some of your lords are very squishy, and this is a rule of thumb for all undead factions in the game, is that if you lose your character, you are in big problems, because that's going to give you a massive negative to leadership, and once that happens, your entire army could start to crumble. Tomb Kings are relatively versatile. They have some artillery, some of the best long-range monstrous infantry in the game in the form of these Ushopters. You can see them here lining up some shots. They bring so much damage from long range. You have Caskets of Souls who also work in artillery, and you have a decent amount of chariots, although you do lack in heavy cavalry. So if you want a fast moving cavalry faction, yeah, the Tomb Kings are not for you. They are a very slow and ponderous faction, looking to grind down the enemy over time. If you want an attrition faction, however, then with some large monsters to support, as well as some range, Tomb Kings are, they're absolutely beautiful. Due to the fact that they crumble rather than running away, you don't really have to worry too much after you've set up your initial deployment zone of how you're going to protect that back line while it dishes out the damage. Well, something I would recommend for new players playing Tomb Kings is having a load of cheap troops in the front line, a couple of big range options, and then one or two large monsters or characters who can spend their entire time protecting your back line, and that's going to get you used to dealing with your opponents who try to sneak in the gaps and really shut you down. Now, one of the very few reasons I would not recommend Tomb Kings for a new player, I think they are a very good faction for new players, is they have some big glaring weaknesses, and that is that your entire faction, for the most part, at least all your big units, have a weakness to fire, and your infantry is very, very susceptible to magic. burning heads, gigantic pendulums. They can roast your entire army in a matter of seconds. So you will have to learn magic a little bit and at least how to counter it. But if you can go over that, Tomb Kings are a very fun faction. They're Egyptian undead themed. So if that sounds like something up your alley, which, I mean, come on, Egyptians and undead, that's got to be up basically everyone's alley, then they could be a very good starting place for you. Would I recommend them to a new player out of all the factions we've talked about so far? They're up there. They are honestly up there. They're one of the weaker factions at the moment, at least most consider that in the meta, but if you get used to commanding your range tools, if you get used to commanding your chariot, to a very key, to be honest, to the Tomb Kings, then you're going to be in an absolutely fantastic position to have some really good games. Again, relatively versatile, but slow. So a slow, ponderous pushing faction, you can go defensive, or go for a slow push, aggressive style of play, who are relatively forgiven in the fact that the majority of the army is basically unbreakable. Undead Pirates. If I had to sell you something about the Vampire Coast, all I'm going to say is undead pirates. What's not to love about these crazy, disgusting zombies who once sailed the seven seas but are now forced to fight for vampires? And it is a very thematic faction, though very limited in playstyle. If you are a defensive lover, then the Vampirates are going to be super perfect for you. Much like the Tomb Kings, much like the Skaven, they really do excel at throwing bodies and bodies of chaff at the enemy to slow them down. And you're going to be doing that in the form of these zombies, and the damage is going to come from your guns. Pirates love cannons. Yes, you can get in there with your cutlasses and dish out the damage to the enemy, but for the most part, you're going to be looking to hold back the enemy whilst your long range dishes out the pain. You also do have access to some rather large creatures. You can bring leviathans, giant crabos, and terrorgeists up in the sky, which are basically bat dragons who are all undead. Your characters are very important, however, because they will be healing up your troops. All undead do get healing, and it is rather lovely. One of definitely the kind of coolest factions, at least thematically wise. If you're looking to get into the game and like, oh, I've got to play a faction for such a long time, I really do want to enjoy the lore behind them, the voice acting, and looking at the models, then I must admit, CA, Creative Assembly, who made this game, did such a good job bringing the Vampire Coast alive. Just look at their models, they are so good. And all round though, very limited. Now you can go aggressive with the Vampirates, but or Vampire Coast. It's kind of Vampirates is what we say for short, because Vampire Counts and Vampire Coast can get mixed up quite a bit. You can go aggressive and kind of rush with crabs and so forth, but 19.999 times out of 20, you're going to be going defensive, because you are a very slow faction who has 0 cavalry. You have 0 skirmishers either. You do have some warhounds, but no long-range skirmishers, but have some of the best cost-effective artillery in the entire game. Now, Vampires can be a little tricky to learn to start with, because you are going to have to learn how to use magic relatively well, and your faction, for the most part, is pretty squishy and very open to being obliterated by enemy magic. But you can sit back, you can chuck wave after wave at your opponent, and it's a good way of learning to micromanage a huge force, because, again, most times you are going to be bringing a large amount of troops to the battlefield. As you can see with this glorious bloated corpse about to charge in, who's a suicide bomber, doing some amazing damage. Oh my god, that was actually kind of cool to catch there on camera. I wish I was recording this as a battle there. So the Vampires, you're going to be sitting back, you're going to be shooting the enemy, but at the same time, unlike the Dwarfs, who have nice elite units you can check out your opponent, you're going to have to learn to micro a huge force all round and protect your caster, because just like the Tomb Kings, losing your leadership for an undead faction is death. It is so bad, because your entire army will then get a huge penalty and start crumbling. I think they're a relatively good faction for a brand new player to play, because not only are they really fun and so much character that you want to play them time and time again, they're defensive, which again is really well suited sometimes to someone who hasn't played many of RTS games before in the past, but at the same time they can be a little bit one-dimensional in the fact, much like the Norska to the ultimate attacking faction, the Vampirates, or Vampire Coast, are the ultimate defensive faction, but they are wielding gigantic large monsters to the battlefield, as well as a load of undead troops. And just like the Tomb Kings, you don't have to worry about your units running away and dragging them back across the battlefield to get them into position. They will crumble rather than run, which means over time they will die if they have low leadership, but it's better than having to stress your micro too much by running around the battlefield and trying to catch all your units who have fled the field. So, if undead pirates seem like to be up your alley, very Pirates of the Caribbean-esque, with a load of large creatures and a load of guns, then this could be the faction for you. We have even more undead madness for you. Now, we're going to be taking a swift little brief look at the Vampire Counts, who are one of the OGs of the game. They've in fact been around since Total War Warhammer 1 as one of the base factions. Now, Vampire Counts can certainly be very fun to play. Like on all undead factions that we've already spoken about, they will crumble rather than run away, and you do not have to worry one little bit about protecting your back line, because unless you're playing like I am right now in a custom game, in multiplayer, you have access to exactly 0 range troops. So you have no range. You're relatively slow in the form of your infantry, so what's good about the Vampire Counts? Why would you bother picking a faction which is very slow, has no skirmish cavalry, at least range variety, no artillery, no ranged units, and a load of slow, ponderous infantry? Well, the Vampire Counts are actually one of the best factions to play if you're a new player, because you don't have to worry about any of that stuff. You also do not have to worry about your units breaking and running away, because they will crumble rather than do that. So what are they as a faction? They are the ultimate grinding faction. They're going to drag down your enemies through sheer attrition. They love to blob. Yeah, it must be said, they do love to blob up quite a bit and do a real slow push. Your battles, if you choose the Vampire Counts, will not be slow. They will, no, not be quick, sorry. They will be incredibly slow. But the creepy ghouls, vampires, and large creatures they bring, such as undead dragons, are very fun to use. Your entire battle plan, 9 times out of 10, will be to swarm your enemy with zombies, ghouls, skeletons, and graveguard, and then that gives you complete freedom to wield gigantic flying bats, large monsters, dragons, and powerful characters to hit home and assassinate your enemy's key targets, dragging them to a murky grave. Now, it must be said, Vampire Counts are a sole attacking unit, as you would expect, or sole attacking army. Due to the fact that they have no range whatsoever, it is literally impossible to play them in a defensive way. So if you're looking for a defensive faction, just skip to the next one, because this is not going to be for you whatsoever. They have to be aggressive, but that by no means makes them bad for a new player, because you don't have to worry about being aggressive. You don't, or being defensive. You don't have to worry about protecting your back line. You simply have to focus on getting there and dishing out damage. They have some of the most powerful lords in the game, some of the coolest creatures as well, and they're just tides and tides of enemy. Your builds in general will have to be relatively big, but because you're not worried about being flanked and so many of your forces are expendable, they're a very good faction to learn how to wield such an ungainly beast, which is an army in Total War Warhammer, because if you lose some zombies, oh well, they're zombies, it really doesn't matter. You only have to focus on a few key targets, and the rest of your army is pretty much, you know, it's expendable. If we want to throw it away, we certainly can do that. So the Vampire Counts only can attack. They are, for all purposes, unbreakable in the form that they're not going to run away, so you don't need to zoom around the battlefield and check too much on what your opponent is in fact doing, but your games will be very, very grindy. You have some heavy hitters in the form of your cavalry, some of the best heavy cavalry in the game in fact, and some very durable infantry, and some of the most hard-hitting characters, but despite this, the majority of your build is going to be slow, ponderous, and in it for the long game. But if that playstyle sounds like it's going to suit you, then I would highly recommend Vampire Counts as a first faction, though personally I'm not the biggest fan of the undead in general, just because lore-wise, it doesn't do quite so much for me. I think they are one of the best factions to learn the game, simply due to the fact you don't have to worry about too much, and they're also very, very forgiving, but a little bit one-dimensional in the fact that you're going to have to attack and grind down your opponent. So that's going to be it for the Vampire Counts. Only a few more factions to go. Let's see what's next on the list. So up next, guys, we're going to be taking a look at the #1 pick, the best faction to learn if you are getting into Total War Warhammer multiplayer for the first time ever. I'm not just saying that because there's a giant magical duck in this army and it looks absolutely amazing. Today we're going to be looking at the Warriors of Chaos and explaining why, if you have never played a Total War game before, if you have never played a multiplayer RTS game before, Chaos are the best faction in the game for you to start out with. And why do I say that? Well, much like the Vampire Counts, they are a very straightforward faction. We're going to go attack the enemy. We have some artillery, but only one in the form of a hell cannon, which certainly can be good in some matchups. And you have no range, which is a little bit of a problem. So you're going to have to, as I've said multiple times already in this kind of guide today, is you're going to have to get aggressive. And I really do, down at the bottom of my heart, though I know there's a lot of defensive plays out there, and it is certainly fine to learn how to play defensive to start with, I really do think aggressive factions are the best way to learn, and Chaos are simply the most basic faction in the game alongside Norska, but they're better. So all the points I made about Norska, we're going to run up to you, we're going to punch you in the face. That is exactly the Chaos way, but they are far more versatile in the fact that they have a load of lords. Way more lords than Norska. They have skirmish cavalry as well, which can certainly be very useful. You can bring large creatures, you can bring elite infantry, who are heavily armoured and very forgiving, or you can bring light infantry to try to swarm your opponent who are cheap, so if they die, it doesn't really matter. Though they do certainly lack in a few departments, they don't have the most access to different laws of magic. They have an okay flying corps as well, but it's not the best, and of course they have no ranged troops to punish your opponent, and very limited artillery. You will certainly have a good fun time with them, plus you will have to definitely learn to use your skirmish cavalry. Both for Norska and Chaos, they really can be abused by the fact they don't have any range. That will force you to learn to find ways to deal with them, and that way will of course be through your skirmish cav and cornering your enemy and overwhelming them with some good micro management. But at the same time, as you can see here, we've left our Chaos Knights in combat far longer than we should, because they're a cavalry unit, should be hitting and running, but they're absolutely fine. They will tank the enemy for days. Our dwarf, not dwarf, oh god, they're very similar to dwarfs in fairness, but the Chaos Warriors holding the line in the front, it's absolutely fine to leave them in here. They're not going to die anytime soon. You have some of the most durable lords as well in the form of Sigvald and the Everwatcher, both of which you can stand and fight for an absolute age of you completely forgetting about them, as I often do. You do have a relatively decent mixture of chariots. You have some lighter chariots and some heavier chariots, which certainly can be some good fun if you're looking to use them. Very limited range options, but some great cavalry, which can certainly be very good fun. Some of the best elite infantry in the game coming in the form of the Chosen, as well as some really good mid-tier infantry, and a load of powerful monsters. You can get giant dragon ogre shagoffs, you can in fact get some dragons, and giant magical ducks. A very simple faction. We're going to run at the enemy, and we're going to try to kill them, and if it doesn't work, oh well. Now, they're not unbreakable, of course, they do not crumble, they're not undead, so you will have to look around the battle and drag troops back in, just like here, this unit ran away, so we need to bring it back over and get it back fighting again. But apart from that, they are very easy to micromanage. You chuck your infantry at the enemy, then just focus on your big scary creatures that you really do want to protect. Now, they are limited in magic, but they do have some of the best laws of magic, so it's not as limiting as you would think. And yeah, that's going to be it for them. A lot faster as well than you would assume of a heavily armoured faction in general. Relatively swift, very powerful rush faction, good at swarming the enemy, have big scary characters, and a decent amount of skirmish tools, chariots, and characters. Warriors of Chaos, a very straightforward, simple faction, which I would highly recommend. Honestly, it's my #1 faction to pick if you are going to be playing Total War Warhammer multiplayer for the first time. Plus, blood for the blood god, what's not to love about them? And now we're going to be delving into my last faction, and certainly one of the toughest ones to learn. Welcome guys to the Wood Elves, the final faction we're going to be covering today in this Which Faction Should You Pick guide. And boy oh boy did we save one of the best factions till last. Wood Elves are very powerful, but they are the definition of glass cannon and one of the toughest factions to learn how to wield. That does not mean though by any means that you should not pick them as one of your first factions, because they are insanely fun. Now if you love the idea of a fast-moving, hard-hitting, the highest risk, the highest reward faction, if that's what gets your adrenaline pumping, the Wood Elves are just the faction that you want to bring. They are incredibly expensive. They are incredibly squishy, but they hit the hardest out of any faction in the game. They have the best archers, the best damage-dealing archers as well, in the form of Waywatchers, able to snipe and destroy an enemy build in half a second. But, likewise, they have the potential to lose a game in half a second as well. They are the swiftest faction in the game. I was speaking about Dark Elves early on, being, you know, fast, hard-hitting, great at skirmish. The Wood Elves do all of that, but better. Some of the best skirmish cavalry in the game, some of the hardest hitting cavalry in the game, but all of it is going to come at a price, of course. You don't get just the best units in the game for nothing. Their entire army is elite. Dryads and Eternal Guard are the cheapest kind of forces you can get, and they're better than most armies, kind of like a mid-tier infantry. So they are a very, very high-risk faction, because if you make one mistake, if just one of your Waywatchers gets taken out, that is so much value gone that you can no longer get back, that you have now wasted. So you can certainly make a ton of mistakes as Wood Elves, but it is also one of the most rewarding factions to play, because when you get them right, you can visualize this right now. Your opponent's build, you poke it once from one side, you poke from the next side, and their build just crumbles to dust and is slaughtered. As you can see, we've just killed his Phoenix in a couple of seconds due to the fact we have so many archers raining in fire from afar. Now, Wood Elves are not a faction I would recommend for you newer players out there if you've never played an RTS game before in your life, because the micro on this faction is very demanding. Probably the most demanding faction in the entire game for micromanagement due to how expensive and squishy they are. But if you're like me, they are one of the first factions I picked up because I really enjoy the fast-paced, live life on the edge style of force who can just delete an enemy character in a couple of seconds. Likewise, the sky is the limit with Wood Elves. They are a very powerful faction, and the better you get at the game, the better you get at micromanagement, the more Wood Elves will indeed reward you. And that's certainly something to give you motivation to keep playing them time and time again. Unfortunately, if you do play Wood Elves, there will be some games where as soon as you load onto the screen and there's 2 minutes of gameplay, you could have already lost the game. And that can be very demoralizing at the same time. But if you can get over that and you can keep going with the Wood Elves, they are a bucket ton of fun, because all Wood Elf units are a risk. All you're doing is doing risk after risk after risk, and you're gambling. And if it pays off, it really does lighten your heart. So that's going to sum it up for all the factions. This was a super brief look, a very brief look at over all the factions. We didn't delve too much in it whatsoever, and that's because I will do faction guides of all of the factions. I'm not sure if I'm going to do them now or when Total War Warhammer 3 comes out. I'll definitely cover quite a few now, as this is kind of how the game's final state is going to be, I suppose, before we do indeed get to Total War Warhammer 3. I should mention about the Wood Elves as well. They are a very aggressive faction. Though you have the best archers in the game, you don't have any artillery. So you are going to have to push close to the enemy and skirmish. They are a skirmish force through and through. You can make death blobs and so forth, but for the most part, you're really looking to pick apart your opponent from range. But anyway, as I was saying, we are going to do deep dives into all the factions, get guests on as well to talk about their factions and what they think's good and bad about them. But hopefully this did give you guys who are not used to the game and wanting to hop in a little bit of a look of what each faction does, just scraping the surface. I didn't want to go too in depth because I really want you guys to explore and have a good time. Find your own playstyles, find which faction you want to play, trial out all of them. But I really do hope this just kind of made the choice a little bit easier and a little bit less daunting for you. Don't worry if you lose a load of games. It's at the start, it's quite a tough game to get into, I will admit that, but I am working on making it a little bit easier. There are links down below to my Discord where you can join, and there's a load of new players there, a load of experienced players if you are looking for help getting into this game. And likewise, I do now do lessons and tutorials over on my Patreon, but there's more information about that all down below in the Discord. So I hope you guys enjoyed this first episode of How to Win at Total War Warhammer. This was really for you newer players out there, and I really look forward to seeing some of you guys in action and playing the game soon. If you guys did enjoy this, make sure to give a thumbs up. Please do as well comment down below on what elements of the game you would like me to focus on, such as like how to build an army, how to use tips and tricks on movement and mobility, basic tactics, and which factions to look into the most. Let me know down below in the comments, and I will take that into consideration when making future How to Win at Total War Warhammer videos. But again, this was only a brief look, so certainly hop in, play some games yourself. That is the best way to learn, and the best way to find out about all these factions and what they have to offer. Again, if you enjoyed, make sure to hit a big fat thumbs up. Make sure to subscribe as well, as I will be doing quite a long series. I think this is a series that hopefully, if you guys enjoy, will go forward into the future, all the way through Total War Warhammer 3, and we're just going to keep hopefully improving and bringing you guys what you like to see. Until next time, guys, peace, and as always, stay awesome.